Someone sits quietly after a conversation ends, and if you look closely, you can see it. Not in their face, not in their posture, but in the space around them. A heaviness that isn't visible but is somehow palpable. They carry an entire response inside their chest that never made it to their mouth. Words that formed, circled, waited at the threshold of their lips, and then retreated back into the quiet. And if you've ever been that person, if you've ever left a conversation with more inside you than when you arrived, then you already know this feeling. The weight of everything you didn't say, the fullness of silence, the strange exhaustion that comes not from speaking too much, but from holding too much. This is not about shyness. This is not about introversion. This is about something deeper, a specific psychology that lives in people who keep their feelings to themselves. And tonight, we explore what that feels like from the inside. There is a moment, usually early, when someone first learns that feelings are safer kept inside than shared. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not one traumatic event that teaches this lesson. It's quieter than that, more gradual, more subtle. It happens through accumulation, through repetition, through 1,000 small moments that add up to one clear understanding. Your emotions are too much for the people around you, or perhaps not too much, but inconvenient, uncomfortable, unwelcome in ways no one says directly, but everyone communicates through tone, through timing, through the small shifts in a room when you begin to express something real. Children who grow up learning to keep their feelings to themselves often begin this learning before they have language for what's happening. They don't think to themselves, I should stop sharing my inner world. It happens more instinctively than that. A child cries and the crying is met with frustration instead of comfort. A child shares excitement and the excitement is dismissed or minimized. A child expresses fear and the fear is corrected rather than held. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, that child begins to understand something fundamental about how the world works. Feelings are something you handle privately. Sometimes it's not even about negative responses. Sometimes it's simply about absence. A child who shares something vulnerable and receives nothing in return. Not cruelty, just emptiness. A parent who is physically present but emotionally unavailable. A caregiver who is too overwhelmed by their own feelings to hold space for anyone else's. And the child learns, not through words but through experience, that their emotions are burdens, that expressing needs creates stress, that the safest way to exist is to need nothing from anyone. There are specific moments that solidify this learning. The teenager who mentions they're struggling and is told, "You think you have problems? Wait until you're an adult." The child who cries and is told, "Stop crying," or "I'll give you something to cry about." The young person who tries to share something difficult and watches their parent become so distressed that they end up comforting the parent instead of being comforted themselves. These moments teach a very specific lesson. Your feelings destabilize others. Your emotions are disruptive. The kindest thing you can do is keep them contained. And so they do. They learn to process everything internally. They learn to become their own comfort, their own counsel, their own support system. Not because they want to be independent, but because independence feels safer than the unpredictability of relying on someone else. They watch how others react to emotional expression, and they make calculations, often unconsciously, about what is safe to reveal and what must stay hidden. They develop an internal radar, a sensitivity to other people's capacity for emotion. They can sense when someone is too stressed to hear about their day. They can feel when their problems would be inconvenient. They can tell when their feelings would create more trouble than they're worth. This sensitivity becomes one of their defining characteristics. They read rooms the way some people read books. They notice the small shifts in tone, the micro expressions that flicker across faces, the tension that enters a space when certain topics arise. And they use this information to edit themselves in real time. They learn what to say and what to keep silent. They learn how to be easy, low maintenance, undemanding. They learn how to exist in a way that doesn't burden anyone with the weight of who they actually are. But here's what most people never realize about this adaptation. It's not that these individuals don't have feelings. It's not that they experience life less intensely than others. If anything, they often feel more, not less. They notice more. They process more. They carry more internal complexity than many people who express themselves freely. The difference is not in the depth of their emotional life. The difference is in what they do with it. They've learned to contain it, to process it alone, to carry it quietly. And this creates a specific kind of internal landscape that others rarely see. Psychologists might call parts of this emotional suppression or avoidant attachment patterns, but those terms don't quite capture what it feels like to live this way. It's not always a conscious suppression. It's more like a learned language, a way of being that feels so natural by the time you're an adult that you don't remember learning it. You don't think, I'm going to withhold my feelings right now. You just do it automatically, the same way you breathe without thinking about breathing. It's become part of your operating system, written into the code of how you interact with the world. And there's something important to understand here. This isn't weakness. This isn't dysfunction. This is adaptation. The human mind is remarkably intelligent in how it protects itself. When a child realizes that expressing their inner world creates problems, discomfort, or distance, their psyche does what any intelligent system would do. It finds another way. It builds internal structures to handle what cannot be handled externally. It creates emotional self-sufficiency, not as a personality trait, but as a survival strategy. Some children learn this through overt messages, families where emotion is explicitly discouraged, where crying is punished, where expressing needs is labelled as weakness or selfishness, where the family motto, spoken or unspoken, is some version of, "We don't talk about those things." These are the families where everyone knows the rules even if no one ever wrote them down. You keep family business private, you don't air your dirty laundry, you handle your problems yourself, you put on a brave face, you don't burden others with your troubles. But many children learn this through something more subtle. Not through explicit rules, but through patterns. The pattern of sharing something vulnerable and watching it get turned into a joke. The pattern of expressing a feeling and having it minimized. You're being too sensitive. That's not that big of a deal. You're overreacting. These small dismissals, repeated over time, teach a clear lesson. Your perception of your own experience is wrong. Your emotional responses are excessive. The problem is not what happened to you, but how you're responding to it. And so the child learns to question their own feelings before anyone else can question them. They learn to minimize their own experiences before anyone else minimizes them. They learn to talk themselves out of their emotions, to convince themselves that what they're feeling isn't valid, isn't reasonable, isn't worth expressing. This internal invalidation becomes so automatic that by the time they're adults, they don't even notice they're doing it. Someone asks how they are, and before they can even access the truth of that question, their mind has already decided the answer. I'm fine. There's also a particular kind of learning that happens when children witness other people being vulnerable and then suffering consequences for it. They watch a sibling express anger and get punished for it. They watch a parent break down and see how it makes everyone uncomfortable. They watch a friend share something personal and see how it changes the way others treat them. And from these observations, they draw conclusions. Vulnerability is risky. Emotional expression has costs. The smart thing to do is keep your inner world private. Some of these children also develop a particular relationship with parentification. They become the ones who take care of others emotionally. The child who comforts their distressed parent. The teenager who mediates family conflicts. The young person who becomes the family therapist. The peacekeeper, the one everyone comes to with their problems. And in taking on this role, they learn something crucial. There is no space for their emotions in a dynamic where they're holding everyone else's. They learn to be the container, never the contained. The listener, never the one who speaks. The one who holds, never the one who is held. This creates a very specific psychology. They become exceptionally good at reading other people's emotional states. They develop a kind of emotional intelligence that comes from necessity rather than natural inclination. They learn to anticipate needs, to sense shifts in mood, to manage the emotional temperature of a room. But this skill comes with a cost. They become so attuned to others that they lose attunement with themselves. They can tell you exactly what everyone else is feeling, but struggle to name what's happening inside their own chest. And here's something that often goes unnoticed. The first few times someone keeps their feelings to themselves, it's a conscious choice. They have a feeling, they consider sharing it, they decide not to, and they feel the weight of that decision. But over time, this process becomes automatic. The gap between feeling something and not expressing it becomes so habitual that they stop noticing the gap exists. They move through their days experiencing emotions internally, but never considering external expression as an option. It's not that they're actively choosing to withhold anymore. It's that withholding has become their default mode of operation. By the time they reach adolescence, this pattern is often deeply established. They're the friend everyone describes as chill or easygoing or never stressed. They're the one who doesn't cause drama, doesn't have emotional outbursts, doesn't need constant reassurance. They're the stable one, the reliable one, the one you don't have to worry about. And from the outside, this looks like maturity. It looks like emotional regulation. It looks like someone who has it together. But from the inside, it feels different. It feels like carrying everything alone. It feels like being a locked room that no one has the key to. It feels like existing behind glass, where you can see out but no one can quite reach in. Their nervous system by this point has learned to operate in a particular way. When something difficult happens, their first instinct is not to reach out but to retreat inward. Not to seek comfort but to self-soothe. Not to process aloud but to analyze silently. Their body has learned that safety comes from self-containment, not from connection. And this becomes wired so deeply that even when they want to open up, even when they consciously decide to share something, their nervous system resists. Their throat tightens, their words disappear, their mind goes blank. Because the body remembers what the conscious mind might want to forget. Vulnerability once felt dangerous, and the body is still protecting them from that danger even when it no longer exists. What's particularly striking about this adaptation is how early it solidifies. Many people who keep their feelings to themselves can trace this pattern back to childhood, sometimes to very early childhood. They were the kid who stopped asking for help with homework because it seemed to frustrate their parents. They were the child who learned to comfort themselves when scared rather than waking their parents. They were the young person who processed their first heartbreak alone in their room because sharing it felt too exposing, too vulnerable, too risky. And there's often a specific memory, a moment they might not even consciously recall, but that shaped everything that came after. The time they were crying and someone walked past without stopping. The time they shared something important and the response was a distracted The time they reached out for emotional support and were met with advice instead of empathy, solutions instead of presence, fixing instead of feeling. These moments, small as they might seem, taught lasting lessons about what is safe and what is not. None of this happens because they're broken or because the people around them were intentionally cruel. Most often, it happens because the people raising them simply didn't know how to hold emotion, didn't have the capacity for it, didn't have models for it themselves. Emotional withholding often travels through generations, passed down not through genetics but through learned patterns of interaction. A parent who keeps their feelings to themselves raises a child who learns to do the same, and that child grows up and continues the pattern, not out of choice but out of the only model they ever had. But regardless of how it began, by the time someone reaches young adulthood, this way of being has become fundamental to how they experience themselves. They don't think of themselves as someone who keeps their feelings inside. They just think of themselves. This is simply who they are. And it's often not until someone points it out, not until a friend says, "You never talk about yourself," or a partner says, "I don't know what you're feeling," that they even realize how little of their inner world they've been sharing. And even then, the realization doesn't automatically change anything. Because the pattern isn't just a habit, it's a protection, it's a structure. It's how their psyche learned to stay safe in a world that didn't feel safe enough for their vulnerability. And so, a specific kind of internal world develops. One that most people never see, one that exists entirely within the confines of a single mind, complete and complex and rich with detail. Because people who keep their feelings to themselves don't experience less than others. They don't live smaller emotional lives. If anything, their internal landscape is often more elaborate, more carefully constructed, more thoroughly examined than those who express themselves freely. The difference is simply this: everything happens inside. Everything gets processed alone. Everything stays contained within the architecture of their own consciousness. If you could step inside the mind of someone who keeps their feelings to themselves, the first thing you'd notice is how busy it is, how active, how full. There's a constant stream of processing happening, a continuous analysis of emotions, interactions, meanings. They're not simply experiencing their feelings and moving on. They're experiencing them, examining them, interpreting them, questioning them, contextualizing them, and then storing them in carefully organized internal spaces. Their mind works like a vast library where every emotional experience gets catalogued, cross-referenced, and filed away for future consideration. When something happens, when they feel something, there's an immediate internal response that most people never witness. Let's say someone says something that hurts their feelings. On the outside, their face might not change. They might nod, they might smile. They continue the conversation as if nothing has shifted. But inside, an entire process has begun. They're feeling the hurt, yes, but they're also simultaneously analysing it. Is this hurt reasonable? Am I being too sensitive? Did they mean it the way I took it? What does this mean about our relationship? Should I say something? What would happen if I said something? What would I even say? This internal dialogue happens so quickly, so automatically, that they're often not even aware it's occurring. It's like breathing. It's like blinking. It's simply what their mind does with emotional experience. And by the time this process completes, which might take seconds or might take hours, the moment for responding has usually passed. The conversation has moved on. The opportunity to address the hurt has closed. And so, the feeling gets added to the internal collection, another item in the vast archive of things they've felt but never said. Their mind becomes its own therapist. They learn to talk themselves through emotions the way a counsellor might guide a client. They ask themselves questions. They challenge their own thinking. They reframe situations. They look for alternative explanations. They practice cognitive restructuring without ever taking a psychology class, simply because this is the only way they've learned to handle what arises inside them. When they're anxious, they don't call a friend. They analyse the anxiety. They trace it back to its source. They examine whether it's rational. They develop strategies to manage it, all internally, all alone. This creates a particular kind of emotional vocabulary that exists only in their private thoughts. They have dozens of words for feelings that most people would simply call sad or angry. They can distinguish between 17 different flavours of loneliness, each one with its own texture, its own origin, its own meaning. They know the difference between the anxiety that comes from uncertainty and the anxiety that comes from overcertainty. They can identify the specific quality of disappointment that arises when someone lets you down versus the disappointment you feel when you let yourself down. This emotional granularity, this sophisticated internal language, develops because they spend so much time alone with their feelings, studying them the way a botanist studies plants. But here's what makes this internal world particularly complex. They're not just experiencing their emotions, they're also watching themselves experience their emotions. There's a part of them that's feeling, and there's another part that's observing the feeling. They develop what psychologists might call metacognitive awareness, this ability to think about their own thinking, to feel their own feeling while simultaneously analysing that they're feeling it. It's like being both the actor and the audience in their own internal theatre. This observer part of them is constantly taking notes. It notices patterns. It recognises when they're repeating old emotional responses. It identifies triggers before the triggered part of them even realises what's happening. It's the part that thinks, "Here I go again," getting anxious about something that probably won't happen, even while the anxiety continues to spiral. It's both incredibly useful and incredibly exhausting. Useful because it gives them insight into themselves that many people never develop. Exhausting because they can never fully lose themselves in an emotion. There's always a part of them standing outside, watching, analysing, commenting. The midnight hours are when this internal world becomes most alive, when the rest of the world is sleeping, when there are no external demands or distractions. Everything they've been carrying rises to the surface. This is when all the conversations they didn't have replay in their mind. All the things they wanted to say but didn't. All the feelings they experienced but never expressed. It's as if their psyche has been waiting all day for this quiet space to finally process everything that happened. They lie in bed and entire dialogues unfold in their head. Full conversations with people they saw hours ago, or days ago, or years ago. They say all the things they couldn't say in the actual moment. They express all the feelings that felt too risky to share in real time. They defend themselves in arguments that have long since ended. They explain themselves to people who never asked for an explanation. They rehearse what they'll say next time, practicing emotional expression in the safety of their own mind, even though next time will probably come and they still won't say any of it. This cognitive rehearsal becomes one of their most frequent mental activities. They play out scenarios before they happen. They imagine conversations they might have. They prepare for emotional situations by mentally walking through them first, testing different responses, anticipating different outcomes. It's a way of trying to control the uncontrollable, to make vulnerability feel safer by practicing it where no one can actually hurt them. But it also means they live many moments twice. Once in imagination, where they say everything they feel, and once in reality, where they say almost nothing. Their journals, if they keep them, tell a story that would shock anyone who knows them in person. Pages and pages of thoughts, feelings, observations, questions. The contrast between what's written and what's spoken is staggering. They might write 10 pages about an interaction that lasted 5 minutes. They might fill an entire notebook processing a relationship, while never once mentioning to the other person that anything needs processing. The gap between their internal reality and their external expression is so vast it's almost like they're living 2 separate lives. And there's a strange comfort in this internal world. It's predictable, it's safe, it's completely under their control. No one can dismiss their feelings if they never share them. No one can minimize their experience if they keep it private. No one can use their vulnerability against them if they remain invulnerable. Their inner world becomes a sanctuary, the one place where they can be completely honest, completely authentic, completely themselves without any risk of judgment or rejection or misunderstanding. But this sanctuary comes with a price. The more time they spend in their internal world, the harder it becomes to bridge the gap to the external one. It's like learning a language that no one else speaks. They become so fluent in internal processing that external expression starts to feel foreign, uncomfortable, almost impossible. When someone asks them a simple question like, "How are you?" they genuinely don't know how to answer, not because they don't know how they are, but because they don't know how to compress the complexity of their internal experience into a socially acceptable response. They develop elaborate systems for managing their emotions without external support. When they're sad, they have rituals. Maybe they watch certain movies that allow them to cry vicariously. Maybe they listen to music that matches their emotional state. Maybe they go for long walks where they can process without interruption. Maybe they clean, organize, work, create, anything that allows them to metabolize feeling through action rather than expression. These self-soothing strategies become so refined, so effective, that they genuinely don't understand why other people need to talk about their feelings. They've learned to handle everything themselves. But what they don't always realize is that handling everything themselves means carrying everything themselves. Their mind becomes crowded with all the emotional experiences they've never fully released. It's not that they're suppressing their feelings in the traditional sense. They're feeling them. They're acknowledging them. They're processing them, but they're doing all of this internally, which means the emotions stay with them longer than they might if they were shared, witnessed, validated by another person. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being your own emotional support system. It's not the exhaustion you can cure with sleep. It's the exhaustion that comes from never being able to put anything down, never being able to hand your burdens to someone else, not even temporarily. They become so used to carrying everything that they forget there's another option. They forget that other people sometimes share the weight. They forget that vulnerability isn't always punished. They forget because their entire internal infrastructure has been built around the opposite assumption. This internal world also shapes how they understand themselves. They develop such a detailed, nuanced self-awareness that they can sometimes see themselves more clearly than people who talk about their feelings regularly. They know their patterns, they know their triggers, they know exactly why they react the way they do. They've spent so many hours analysing themselves that they've become experts on their own psychology. But this expertise can also create a strange kind of loneliness. Because they understand themselves so well, they assume others understand them too, or at least could understand them if they paid attention. And it's painful to realise how invisible their internal world remains. How much of who they are exists in a space no one else can access. They develop what might be called internal working models, complete psychological frameworks they've constructed to make sense of themselves and others. They have theories about why people do what they do. They have explanations for their own behaviour patterns. They have mental maps of their emotional landscape that they've been refining for years. These models are often remarkably accurate, sophisticated in ways that would impress trained psychologists, but they're also entirely private. No one knows about these frameworks because they never share them. No one knows how deeply they think about human behaviour because they keep those thoughts to themselves, and there's something both powerful and sad about this. Powerful because they've done the internal work that many people avoid. They've faced themselves, examined themselves, tried to understand themselves without the aid of a therapist or even a trusted friend. They've taken responsibility for their own emotional education, but sad because all of this wisdom, all of this insight, all of this careful self-understanding remains locked inside them. They carry knowledge about themselves that could help others understand them, but they never share it. They hold keys to their own depths, but never hand those keys to anyone else. The question, what are you thinking, terrifies them, not because they're not thinking anything, but because they're thinking everything. They're thinking 17 different thoughts, simultaneously, each one branching into multiple subtopics, each one connected to memories, patterns, meanings. How do you compress that into a sentence? How do you choose which of the 17 thoughts to share? How do you explain the context that makes any of those thoughts make sense? So instead of trying, they usually just say nothing, or I don't know, or just stuff. And the person who asks accepts this answer and moves on, never knowing they just encountered a locked door to an entire universe. Their internal dialogue is so constant, so persistent, that silence on the outside doesn't mean silence on the inside. They can sit perfectly still, perfectly quiet, while their mind is running through scenarios, analysing conversations, processing emotions, making connections between past and present, rehearsing future interactions, questioning old decisions, wondering about alternate outcomes. They're never bored, because there's always something happening internally. They're never at a loss for entertainment because their own thoughts provide endless material. But this constant internal activity also means they can't always distinguish between what they've thought and what they've said aloud. Sometimes they have such vivid internal conversations with someone that they genuinely believe they've had that conversation in reality. They remember explaining themselves so clearly in their mind that they're surprised when the other person has no idea what they're talking about. This blurring between internal and external can make them feel even more isolated, because it highlights how much of their life happens in a space no one else can see or access or validate. There's also a particular relationship they develop with time in their internal world. External time moves normally, but internal time can stretch or compress dramatically. They can spend 3 hours processing an interaction that lasted 3 minutes. They can replay a single sentence someone said to them dozens of times, examining it from every possible angle, wondering about tone and intention and meaning. Or conversely, they can experience something intense and immediately compartmentalize it, storing it away so efficiently that it's as if it hardly happened at all. Their internal world operates on its own timeline, one that doesn't always match the external pace of life. And through all of this, through all the internal processing and analysing and cataloguing and rehearsing, there's often an underlying question they're trying to answer. A question they may not even consciously recognise they're asking. The question is some version of, am I okay? Are my feelings reasonable? Is my perception accurate? Because they've spent so much of their life having their emotional responses questioned or minimised, they've internalised that questioning. They've become their own harshest critics, their own most sceptical analysts. Even in the privacy of their own mind, they're checking themselves, doubting themselves, wondering if they have the right to feel what they're feeling. This self-doubt exists alongside profound self-knowledge, and that's part of what makes their internal world so complex. They can simultaneously know themselves deeply and question themselves constantly. They can be intimately familiar with their emotional patterns, while still wondering if those patterns are valid. They can understand exactly why they feel a certain way, while also believing they shouldn't feel that way. Their internal world is full of these paradoxes, these contradictions that somehow coexist without resolution. But perhaps the most important thing to understand about the internal landscape of someone who keeps their feelings to themselves is this: it's not empty, it's not barren, it's not a void where emotion should be. It's the opposite. It's rich, it's complex, it's full, it's a complete world that exists without witnesses. It's a theatre where elaborate dramas unfold without an audience. It's a conversation that happens with only one voice. And the loneliness isn't from lacking feelings. The loneliness is from having so many feelings that no one else ever sees. But all of this internal richness, all of this elaborate emotional landscape remains invisible to the outside world, because people who keep their feelings to themselves have learned to construct an external presentation that reveals almost nothing about what's happening inside. And this presentation isn't exactly false. It's not deception. It's more like translation. They take the complexity of their internal experience and compress it into something manageable, something socially acceptable, something that won't burden anyone with the weight of their actual truth. And over time, this translation becomes so automatic that they barely notice they're doing it anymore. The performance begins the moment they enter a social space. Not a conscious performance, not something they plan or rehearse, though in a way they've been rehearsing it their entire lives. It's more like putting on a coat before going outside. You don't think about it, you just do it. The external self emerges, the version of them that knows how to navigate social interaction without revealing anything too real, too raw, too complicated. This version smiles at the right moments, nods at the appropriate times, responds with acceptable answers, maintains the appearance of someone who is fine, who is handling things, who requires nothing from anyone. And the word "fine" becomes their most frequently used defense. Someone asks how they are, and the answer comes before they even access the question. I'm fine. I'm good. Can't complain. These phrases roll off their tongue so smoothly, so effortlessly, that no one thinks to question them. And why would they? The person seems fine. Their face shows no distress. Their voice carries no strain. Their body language suggests calm. Everything about their external presentation confirms the words they're saying, but inside is often an entirely different story. They could be carrying heartbreak, anxiety, exhaustion, confusion, loneliness. They could have cried that morning in the shower. They could have spent the entire previous night unable to sleep, mind racing through worries. They could be navigating something genuinely difficult. But when they step into a room, when someone asks how they are, all of that gets compressed into 2 words. I'm good. And they say it with such conviction that people believe them. They've learned to make their outer presentation match what others expect, what others find comfortable, what others can handle without needing to do anything in response. This creates a particular kind of exhaustion that most people don't understand. Because maintaining this external presentation requires energy, emotional labour, the constant monitoring of their own expression, their own tone, their own body language, making sure nothing slips through that shouldn't, making sure their face doesn't reveal what their heart is carrying, making sure their voice stays steady even when their chest feels tight. It's like being an actor who never gets to leave the stage, who can never fully drop character, who has to maintain the performance even when they're tired of performing, and the strangest part is how good they become at it. How convincing. They can smile while their mind is elsewhere. They can laugh while their heart is heavy. They can engage in light conversation while processing something dark internally. They develop this ability to split themselves, to function on multiple levels simultaneously. The external level that interacts with others and the internal level that continues its private experience regardless of what's happening on the surface. It's like living in 2 dimensions at once, managing both without letting either one collapse. People around them often have no idea this is happening. They see someone who appears calm, collected, unbothered by things that would upset others. They see someone who doesn't seem to have problems, or at least not problems that interfere with their ability to show up and function. And because the performance is so seamless, because the mask fits so well, people start to believe that's who this person actually is. The calm one, the stable one, the one who never falls apart, the one you don't have to worry about. But being the calm one in crisis doesn't mean they're not experiencing the crisis internally. It just means they've learned to manage their external response while their internal world reacts completely differently. When something stressful happens, when there's an emergency or a conflict or unexpected bad news, everyone else might panic or get emotional or lose their composure, and they remain steady. Not because they're not affected, but because their nervous system learned long ago to keep the internal storm private. They can be terrified while appearing brave. They can be overwhelmed while seeming capable. They can be breaking while looking whole. This creates a strange dynamic in relationships. People come to rely on their calmness, their steadiness, their ability to remain unshaken. They become the person others turn to when everything else is chaos, the emotional anchor, the voice of reason, the one who keeps perspective when everyone else is losing it. And they take on this role because they've been trained for it their entire lives. But no one realizes that taking on this role means they can never be the one who falls apart. Someone has to be calm, so they're calm. Someone has to be strong, so they're strong. Someone has to hold it together, so they do. Even when they don't want to. Even when they need to fall apart too. They've also mastered the art of deflection. When conversations get too close to their actual feelings, too close to their real internal experience, they know how to redirect. They'll answer a question about themselves with a joke that makes everyone laugh and moves the conversation forward without revealing anything. They'll turn the question back on the other person. Enough about me. What about you? And people, being naturally more interested in talking about themselves anyway, usually accept this redirection without noticing they learned nothing about the person who deflected. Or they'll answer with facts instead of feelings. Someone asks, "How are you handling that situation?" And they'll respond with what they're doing about it rather than how they're feeling about it. "Well, I've been researching options and I think I'll probably..." They give the practical details, the action steps, the logical analysis, and the person asking usually accepts this as an answer because it sounds substantial. It sounds like engagement. But it's engagement that carefully avoids the emotional truth underneath all those actions. They become incredibly skilled at giving people enough to satisfy curiosity without giving them access to anything real. It's like offering someone the lobby of a building while keeping all the inner rooms locked. People feel like they've been let in, like they know this person, but really they've only seen the most public, most carefully curated spaces. The rest remains private, hidden, inaccessible. And after social interactions, even pleasant ones, even ones they enjoyed, they often feel profoundly exhausted. Not because the interaction was bad, but because maintaining the external presentation takes energy they don't always have. They come home and the mask finally comes off, and they feel the full weight of everything they were carrying while appearing to carry nothing. It's like being on your feet all day and finally sitting down and only then realizing how much your legs hurt. The pain was there the entire time, but you couldn't attend to it while you were still moving. This exhaustion surprises people who don't understand it. Because from the outside, nothing happened. They went to a gathering, they chatted, they seemed fine, they came home. What's exhausting about that? But what others don't see is the constant internal management required to navigate social space while keeping their actual feelings contained. The monitoring, the self-editing, the decision-making about what's safe to show and what needs to stay hidden. The emotional labour of managing not just their own feelings, but everyone else's comfort with those feelings. They're often told things like, "Yeah, you never seem stressed," or "Nothing ever bothers you," or "I wish I could be as calm as you are." And these comments, meant as compliments, feel complicated. Because they're not compliments exactly. They're misperceptions, evidence of how successful the performance has been, evidence that no one sees what's actually happening inside. And they usually just smile and say thank you. Because how do you explain that you're not calm, you're just very good at appearing calm? How do you tell someone that actually many things bother you, you've just learned not to show it? There's also a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being chronically misunderstood in this particular way. People think you have no problems because you don't talk about your problems. People think you're always fine because you always say you're fine. People think you don't need support because you never ask for support. And over time, this creates a reality where even if you wanted to reach out, even if you wanted to ask for help, you wouldn't know how. Because you've trained everyone around you to believe you don't need anything. You've performed independence so convincingly that people have come to believe it's true. The performance also becomes a habit that's hard to break, even when you want to break it. Your mouth forms the words, "I'm fine," before your brain can even consider telling the truth. Your face arranges itself into a smile before you realize you don't feel like smiling. Your voice takes on a light, easy tone even when discussing something that's actually heavy for you. These responses have become so automatic, so deeply ingrained, that they happen without conscious choice. You're performing even when you don't mean to perform, even when you wish you could just be honest. And there's something particularly painful about the gap between how you're perceived and who you actually are. To be seen as someone with no depth, no complexity, no inner struggles, when your internal world is rich with all of those things. To be seen as shallow when you're actually an ocean. To be seen as emotionally simple when you're emotionally sophisticated. To be seen as unbothered when you're carrying more than most people realize anyone could carry. The gap between external perception and internal reality grows so wide that sometimes you feel like you're living two completely different lives. But the mask serves a purpose. This is important to remember. It's not arbitrary. It's not pointless. It protects them. It keeps them safe. It allows them to move through the world without constantly having to defend their emotional experience, explain their inner world, or risk the vulnerability that comes with being fully seen. The mask is armor that they needed at some point, and that still feels necessary now, even when part of them wishes they could remove it. The performance of fine, the maintenance of this external presentation, is both a survival strategy and a prison. It allows them to function in a world that often doesn't make space for emotional complexity, but it also keeps them isolated in their own experience, never quite able to bridge the gap between how they appear and how they feel. And most people who keep their feelings to themselves exist in this strange in-between space. Visible but not seen, present but not known, functioning but not fine, performing a version of themselves that others find acceptable while the true self remains carefully tucked away, safe but lonely, protected but disconnected, whole but somehow split. And they carry this performance through their days, through their years, through their lives, walking through the world wearing a face that isn't quite their face, speaking in a voice that isn't quite their voice, being a version of themselves that is real enough to be convincing but edited enough to be safe. And no one applauds this performance. No one recognizes it as the elaborate emotional choreography that it is, because the best performances are the ones that don't look like performances at all, the ones that appear effortless, natural, true, and they've become so good at performing that even they sometimes forget they're doing it, sometimes forget there's a difference between the person they show the world and the person they actually are. And nowhere does this performance become more complicated than in the spaces that are meant to be the most intimate. Because relationships, real relationships, require something that people who keep their feelings to themselves find almost impossible to give. Access, opening, the gradual revelation of the self that exists behind the presentation. And this creates a particular kind of struggle that defines much of how they experience connection. They want intimacy. They crave it. They desire to be known, to be seen, to be understood at the deepest levels. But simultaneously, the vulnerability required for that kind of intimacy feels dangerous in ways they can barely articulate. This paradox shapes everything about how they move through relationships. They're drawn to closeness, but terrified of exposure. They want someone to understand them without having to explain themselves. They desire a connection that feels safe enough to open up in, but their very act of withholding prevents the safety from fully forming. It's a cycle that repeats itself across friendships, romantic partnerships, even family relationships. The people closest to them are often the ones who know them the least. Not because they don't spend time together, but because proximity doesn't equal revelation. You can be in the same room with someone every day and still keep your inner world completely private. In romantic relationships, this dynamic becomes especially pronounced, because romantic love, at least the kind most people talk about, requires vulnerability. It requires sharing fears, admitting needs, expressing desires. It requires saying, "I'm hurt" when you're hurt, and "I need you" when you need someone. But for people who keep their feelings to themselves, these expressions don't come naturally. They don't feel safe, even with someone they love, even with someone who loves them. The instinct to protect, to contain, to keep their emotional world private runs so deep that it persists even in relationships where that protection might not be necessary anymore. They often find themselves attracted to one of two types of people: either someone who doesn't push, doesn't ask too many questions, accepts surface-level connection without demanding depth, or someone who does push, who wants to know everything, who asks questions and won't accept deflection. And interestingly, both types of relationships create problems. With someone who doesn't push, they feel safe but also unseen. They can maintain their privacy, but they also feel lonely, wondering if this person even wants to know them. With someone who does push, they feel pursued but also pressured. They want to open up, but the pushing itself activates their defenses, makes them retreat further into themselves. There's a specific kind of conflict that arises frequently in their romantic relationships. Their partner says something like, "I feel like I don't really know you," or "You never tell me what you're thinking," or "I can't tell if you even need me." And they're genuinely confused by this because from their perspective, they are letting this person in. They're in a relationship, they're spending time together, they're physically present, they're committed. Isn't that enough? But what they don't always understand is that their partner is experiencing the same thing everyone else experiences. The external presentation, the performance of fine, the edited version, not the full truth of their internal world. And when their partner tries to go deeper, tries to ask about feelings, tries to create space for emotional expression, they often feel put on the spot, cornered, like they're being asked to perform a kind of emotional display that doesn't feel natural to them. The question, "What are you feeling right now?" can create genuine panic. Not because they're not feeling anything, but because they're feeling too much and don't know how to compress it into words, especially not under pressure, especially not when someone is watching, waiting for an answer. They show love differently than they're often asked to show it. They show it through actions, through remembering small details, through being reliable, consistent, present, through doing things for their partner without being asked, through creating comfort, solving problems, making life easier in practical ways. And in their mind, these actions speak clearly. They're saying "I love you" through everything they do. but their partner often needs to hear the words, needs verbal affirmation, needs emotional expression that matches the depth of what they're feeling. And this creates a painful mismatch where both people are loving each other, but in languages the other doesn't fully recognize. There's also a particular loneliness that exists in relationships for people who keep their feelings to themselves. The loneliness of lying next to someone at night and carrying thoughts you can't share. The loneliness of being in love with someone who doesn't fully know you. The loneliness of wanting to reach out, but not knowing how. Their partner might be right there, available, willing to listen. But the barrier isn't external. The barrier is internal. It's the habit, the pattern, the deeply ingrained instinct that says feelings are private, that vulnerability is risky, that opening up might lead to consequences they can't predict or control. And because they struggle to express their own needs, they often become hyper-focused on meeting their partner's needs. They're attentive, observant, responsive to their partner's emotions. They can tell when their partner is upset before their partner says anything. They can sense shifts in mood, changes in energy, and they respond to these shifts, trying to provide comfort or support or space, whatever seems needed. But they rarely ask for the same in return. They rarely say, "I'm struggling," or "I need support," or "Can you just hold me while I fall apart for a moment?" This creates an imbalance that their partner might not even notice at first. Because the person who keeps their feelings to themselves is so good at taking care of others, so skilled at being the strong one, the steady one, that it's easy to fall into a dynamic where they're always the giver and never the receiver. And they often prefer this dynamic. It feels safer to be the one supporting rather than the one needing support. Safer to be the listener rather than the one who speaks. Safer to hold space for someone else's emotions than to ask someone to hold space for theirs. But over time, this imbalance creates distance. Because true intimacy requires reciprocity. It requires both people being vulnerable, both people being seen, both people allowing themselves to need the other. And when one person consistently withholds, consistently stays behind the wall, consistently maintains the performance of being fine, the relationship can only go so deep. There's a limit to how intimate you can be with someone who won't let you fully in. Their friends experience a similar dynamic. They're often described as a great listener, a trusted confidant, someone people can tell anything to. And this is true. They are safe to confide in. They hold secrets well. They don't judge. They provide thoughtful responses. They make people feel heard and understood. But the relationship is rarely reciprocal. Their friends tell them everything. They tell their friends almost nothing. And their friends might not even realize this imbalance exists because the person who withholds is so good at keeping the focus on others, at asking questions, at making the conversation about anything other than themselves. There's a particular moment that happens sometimes in friendships. A friend might suddenly realize they've been talking about themselves for an hour and haven't asked a single question in return. They might feel embarrassed, might say something like, "I'm sorry, I've been talking this whole time. What about you? What's going on with you?" And the person who keeps their feelings to themselves will smile and say something vague. "Oh, you know, same old stuff, nothing interesting." And the friend, relieved not to feel guilty anymore, will accept this answer and the moment will pass. And the truth, all the complicated, difficult, interesting things actually happening in their internal world, remains unspoken. They become the friend everyone calls in crisis, but who never calls anyone themselves. The friend who shows up when needed but never asks for anyone to show up for them. The friend who gives advice, perspective, support, but never seeks it. And this feels natural to them, comfortable, right. Because this is the role they've always played, the emotional caretaker, the one who holds but is never held, the one who witnesses but is never witnessed. But there's a cost to always being the strong friend, the reliable one, the one people don't worry about. The cost is that no one really knows what's happening in your life. No one knows when you're struggling because you never say you're struggling. No one knows when you need support because you never ask for support. And even if you wanted to reach out, even if you had a moment of wanting to be the one who's taken care of, you wouldn't know how to do it. Because you've trained everyone around you through years of consistency that you don't need anything from anyone. In family dynamics, similar patterns often emerge, though sometimes they originated there. They might be the child who never caused problems, never needed much attention, never asked for help. And this made them easy for their parents, but it also made them invisible in certain ways. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and they were never squeaky. So they learned to handle everything alone, and their family learned not to check in too closely because they seemed fine. And years later, even as adults, this dynamic persists. Family gatherings where they ask about everyone else's lives but no one thinks to ask detailed questions about theirs. Holiday phone calls where they listen to everyone's news but share almost nothing about themselves. And the guilt compounds when people do try to get closer. When a partner expresses frustration about feeling shut out. When a friend says they wish they knew more about what's going on in their life. When family members comment that they never share anything. Because they don't want to be this way. They don't want to create distance. They don't want to shut people out. But changing feels impossible. Opening up feels like learning to speak a foreign language. The words exist somewhere inside them. But bringing them to the surface, forming them into sentences, speaking them aloud to another person, it all feels forced and unnatural and terrifying. There's also the phenomenon that people who work with emotions sometimes call the vulnerability hangover. Those rare moments when they do open up, when they do share something real, something vulnerable, something true about their internal experience. And in the moment, it might feel okay, might even feel good. A relief to finally say something out loud, to let someone else hold it with them for a moment. But later, after the conversation ends, after they're alone again, a different feeling emerges. Regret, embarrassment, a sense of having revealed too much, of having been too exposed, too raw, too honest. They replay the conversation in their mind and cringe at their own openness. They worry about how they were perceived. They fear they've burdened the other person. They wonder if they've changed the dynamic in ways they can't take back. This vulnerability hangover reinforces their instinct to keep things inside, because even when opening up goes well, even when the other person responds with care and understanding, the internal discomfort that follows makes it feel like it wasn't worth it, like staying quiet would have been safer, like they should have just handled it alone the way they always do. And so the next time an opportunity for vulnerability arises, they remember this discomfort and they choose silence again. The cycle reinforces itself, and yet, despite all of this, despite the walls and the performance and the withholding, they do love. They love deeply. They love intensely. They love with a sincerity that would surprise people who think they're emotionally distant. Their love just doesn't always look the way others expect love to look. It's quiet love, steady love. Love expressed through presence and consistency, and small acts of care rather than through grand declarations or emotional displays. It's love that lives more in actions than in words, more in what they do than in what they say. They notice everything about the people they love. They remember. They pay attention. They show up. They're there in the ways that matter, even if they struggle to say "I love you" out loud. And for some people, this is enough. Some people can feel loved through actions alone. But for others, particularly those who need verbal affirmation, who need emotional expression, who need to hear the words as well as see the actions, this quiet love can feel insufficient, can feel like something is missing. And this creates a painful situation where they're loving someone as fully as they know how, but it's not being received as fully as it's being given. The deepest pain in relationships for people who keep their feelings to themselves is often this: they're capable of profound connection. They want profound connection. But the very mechanisms they've built to protect themselves also prevent the connection they desire. They're trapped behind their own walls, safe but lonely, protected but unseen, together with someone but still somehow alone. And they can see this dynamic, they can understand it intellectually. But understanding doesn't automatically translate into change, because these patterns aren't just habits, they're survival strategies that have been reinforced for so long they feel like part of their identity. Changing them would require becoming someone they don't know how to be. And that uncertainty feels more dangerous than the familiar loneliness they already carry. And so a question emerges that seems simple, but holds profound complexity. If feelings are experienced but never expressed, where do they go? Because they don't simply evaporate, they don't vanish into thin air. Emotions are not abstract concepts that exist only in the mind. They are physical experiences, biochemical events, energy that moves through the body seeking release. And when that release is consistently denied, when expression is consistently withheld, the feelings don't disappear. They accumulate, they settle, they find other places to live. The body becomes a museum of unspoken things, a vast archive where every unexpressed emotion gets stored, catalogued, preserved. Not in language, not in clear memory, but in sensation, in tension, in the places where muscles hold tight without apparent reason, in the chest that feels constricted even though there's nothing physically wrong, in the jaw that clenches during sleep, in the shoulders that carry weight no one else can see. The body remembers what the mouth never said. The body holds what the heart couldn't share. People who keep their feelings to themselves often experience this embodied storage in ways they don't immediately recognize as connected to emotion. They might have chronic tension in their neck and shoulders. They might experience frequent headaches that have no clear medical cause. They might have digestive issues that appear and disappear without explanation. They might feel exhausted even after sleeping well. They might experience their body as uncomfortable, tight, restricted, without understanding why. And if someone asks, "Are you stressed?" they'll often say no because they don't feel stressed mentally. They feel fine. But their body is telling a different story. The body speaks in its own language. It says through sensation what cannot be said through words. That tightness in your chest when you're around certain people, that's your body holding feelings about that relationship that you haven't acknowledged. That knot in your stomach when you think about certain situations, that's anxiety you've intellectualized but never fully felt. That heaviness in your limbs that makes everything feel effortful. That's the weight of carrying everything alone for too long. The body is remarkably honest, even when the mind has learned to lie, to minimize, to say, "I'm fine," when nothing is fine. And there's a particular phenomenon that happens to people who suppress their feelings for extended periods. Their bodies become hypervigilant, constantly braced for impact even when there's no threat. Their nervous system stays activated at low levels all the time, never fully relaxing, never fully letting go. This creates a baseline of tension they become so accustomed to that it feels normal. They don't realize their shoulders are always slightly raised. They don't notice they're breathing shallowly. They don't recognize that their body is in a constant state of mild constriction, because this has been their normal for so long they have nothing to compare it to. But sometimes the body can't hold everything anymore. Sometimes the capacity for storage reaches its limit, and what was carefully contained suddenly overflows, usually at the most unexpected moments. They're watching a television commercial, something ordinary, something that shouldn't be emotional at all, and suddenly they're crying. Not just tearing up, but full sobbing. The kind of crying that feels like it's coming from somewhere deep and old and long stored, and they're confused by their own response. Why am I crying about a commercial for cleaning products? But it's not about the commercial. The commercial was just the crack in the dam, a small opening that allowed everything stored behind it to finally flow. This is why people who keep their feelings to themselves often cry at movies, at songs, at other people's stories, but rarely at their own. They experience what psychologists might call vicarious emotional release. They can access feelings through someone else's narrative that they can't access through their own. They can cry for a fictional character's loss because it's safe. The character isn't real, so the vulnerability doesn't count. They can feel the full weight of grief, or heartbreak, or loneliness when it belongs to someone in a film because it's contained, boundaried, not their actual life. But when it comes to their own losses, their own heartbreaks, their own loneliness, the tears don't come. Those feelings stay locked inside, and this creates a strange relationship with their own emotional responses. They don't trust their feelings when they finally do surface. They think they're overreacting, being dramatic, making too much of small things. Because the emotion that finally breaks through often feels disproportionate to whatever triggered it. They cry harder about a sad movie than they did when their own relationship ended. They feel more anger at a minor inconvenience than they felt during a major betrayal. But this isn't disproportionate at all when you understand what's actually happening. They're not just feeling the emotion of the present moment, they're feeling all the accumulated emotions from all the moments they didn't allow themselves to feel. The pressure has been building for so long that when it finally releases, it releases with force. Dreams become another sideways expression of everything they can't say while awake. In their dreams, they have the arguments they never had in real life. They say all the things they've been holding back. They express anger, grief, fear, desire, all the emotions they keep carefully contained during waking hours. They wake up with their heart racing, with the residue of feelings that felt so intense in the dream, but that they still can't access in daylight. Their unconscious mind is processing what their conscious mind won't allow. Their sleeping self says what their waking self keeps silent. Some find creative outlets for feelings they can't express directly. They write but never send the emails, the letters, the messages that contain their truth. Pages and pages of words that pour out, usually late at night when their defenses are tired, when the internal editor is less vigilant. They write everything they feel, everything they think, everything they wish they could say, and then they save it in a folder no one will ever see, or they delete it, or they keep physical journals that they hide away. The expression happens, but it happens in private, in secret, in a space that feels safe because it's controlled. No one can respond, no one can judge, no one can use their vulnerability against them. Others channel unexpressed emotion into art, music, work, physical activity. They create something beautiful from the feelings they can't verbalize. They paint without knowing they're painting their loneliness. They play music without recognizing they're expressing their grief. They work obsessively without understanding they're trying to outrun their anxiety. The emotion finds its way out, just not through direct expression. Not through saying, "I feel sad," or "I'm angry," or "I'm scared." Instead, it's transmuted, transformed, channeled into something else, something that feels safer because it's less direct, less revealing, less vulnerable. But this kind of sideways expression, while it provides some release, doesn't fully discharge the emotion the way direct expression might. It's like steam escaping slowly from a pressure cooker, rather than the lid being properly released. Some pressure dissipates, but not all of it. Not enough. And so the accumulation continues. Layer upon layer of unexpressed feeling, each one adding to the weight, each one taking up space in the body that could otherwise be relaxed, open, free. There's also a phenomenon where people who store their feelings develop physical symptoms that mirror their emotional state, but that get interpreted as purely physical problems. The person who can't speak their truth develops chronic throat tightness or loses their voice frequently. The person who's carrying too much emotional burden develops back pain. The person who can't fully take in life, who's holding their breath emotionally, develops breathing issues. The body is remarkably literal in how it expresses what the mind won't acknowledge. But because they've learned to focus on the physical and ignore the emotional, they treat the symptom without ever addressing the cause. They go to doctors, try medications, adjust their posture, change their diet. And sometimes these things help temporarily, but the symptom returns because the underlying emotional storage remains unaddressed, and they themselves might not see the connection. Someone might tell them, stress can cause physical symptoms, and they'll nod and agree in principle but not recognize that it applies to them. Because they don't feel stressed. They feel fine. They've mastered the art of feeling fine even when nothing is fine. They've become so skilled at compartmentalizing, at separating mind from body, that they genuinely don't recognize the relationship between their unexpressed emotions and their physical discomfort. The exhaustion they carry is another manifestation of this storage. Not just physical tiredness, though, that's part of it, but a deeper exhaustion, a fatigue that exists at the level of the soul, the exhaustion of holding, containing, managing, controlling their emotional world without ever releasing any of it. It's like holding your breath. You can do it for a while, but eventually you need to exhale. And they never exhale. They just keep holding. And the effort of that holding, even though it's become automatic, drains energy they don't realize they're spending. People might tell them they seem tired, they look exhausted, they should rest more. And they do rest. They sleep adequate hours. They take breaks. They try to relax. But the exhaustion doesn't lift, because it's not that kind of tired. It's not the kind that sleep fixes. It's the tired that comes from carrying invisible weight for too long. The tired that comes from managing an internal world that never gets witnessed or shared. the tired that comes from being the only person who knows what's actually happening inside you. And sometimes, seemingly out of nowhere, they break down. A full collapse. Not dramatic usually, not public, but in the privacy of their home, in their car, in the shower where no one can hear them, something gives way. Everything they've been holding rushes forward at once, and they finally let themselves fall apart. They cry like they haven't cried in years. They feel everything they've been avoiding. They acknowledge the pain, the loneliness, the fear, the anger, all of it. And in the moment, it feels catastrophic. It feels like they're breaking, like they're losing control, like everything they've worked so hard to contain is now uncontainable. But these breakdowns, as terrifying as they feel in the moment, are actually the body's way of forcing what the mind refuses to allow. They're emergency releases, necessary purges of accumulated emotion that simply cannot be stored any longer. And often, after these breakdowns, they feel lighter, emptier in a good way, like something that needed to happen finally happened. But then, after a day or two, the old patterns re-establish themselves. The walls go back up, the containment returns, the performance of fine resumes, because one breakdown doesn't undo years of learned behaviour. It provides temporary relief, but it doesn't change the fundamental pattern. And here's what makes this storage particularly painful. They often can't even explain to themselves what's wrong. Someone who cares about them might notice they seem off, might ask if they're okay, might offer to listen, and they want to explain. They want to unpack everything they're carrying. But when they try to form words, nothing comes. Or what comes out feels inadequate, insufficient, not quite right. "I'm just tired" is all they can manage, even though tired is such an incomplete description of what they're experiencing. Even though what they mean is, "I'm carrying weight you can't see and I don't know how to put it down." But those words feel too big, too revealing, too vulnerable to actually speak, so they carry it. They continue carrying it. The body continues storing it, in muscles that never quite relax, in breath that never quite deepens, in a nervous system that never quite settles, in tension that becomes so familiar it feels like part of their identity. They become a walking archive of their own unexpressed emotional history. Every unfelt feeling, every unspoken word, every withheld emotion, all of it preserved somewhere in the physical form, not visible to others, but always present, always there, always taking up space that could be used for something else, something lighter, something freer, something that doesn't require such careful, constant, exhausting containment. And within all of this storage, within all of this accumulated weight, something strange develops. A way of being that doesn't quite make sense if you try to understand it logically. Because people who keep their feelings to themselves exist in a state of constant contradiction. Not confusion, not inconsistency, but genuine paradox. They hold opposing truths simultaneously, carry contradictory realities within the same body, the same mind, the same heart, and these contradictions don't cancel each other out. They coexist, they layer, they create a complexity that others often misinterpret as mixed signals or emotional unavailability, when really it's just the natural result of a psychology built around both feeling deeply and expressing minimally. They feel everything with remarkable intensity and yet show almost nothing. This is perhaps the central paradox. Their internal emotional world is rich, nuanced, constantly active. They notice subtle shifts in atmosphere that others miss entirely. They pick up on emotional undercurrents in conversations. They feel the weight of other people's moods, the tension in rooms, the unspoken conflicts hovering in the air. They experience their own emotions with a depth that would surprise anyone who knows them casually. But none of this internal richness translates to external expression. Their face remains neutral. Their voice stays even. Their body language suggests calm. The intensity of their inner experience and the minimalism of their outer presentation exist simultaneously. Two truths that seem contradictory but are both completely real. They care intensely about people while appearing indifferent. They might love someone deeply, think about them constantly, notice every detail about them, worry about their well-being, feel genuine concern for their happiness. But from the outside, this care is nearly invisible. They don't check in frequently. They don't express their concern in obvious ways. They don't say, "I've been thinking about you," or "I was worried about you," or "you matter to me." So the person receiving this care often doesn't know it exists. They might even think this person doesn't care at all, when the truth is the opposite. The care is profound. It's just silent, unexpressed, held privately in a space the other person can't access. They want connection desperately while simultaneously finding it terrifying. They crave intimacy, genuine understanding, someone who sees past the performance to who they actually are. But the vulnerability required for that kind of connection activates every defense mechanism they've built. So they want closeness and fear it at the same time, want to be known and are afraid of being seen, want someone to understand them without having to explain themselves, which is perhaps an impossible desire but one they hold nonetheless. They move toward people and pull away from people, sometimes in the same moment, wanting and resisting connection with equal force. They're deeply empathetic listeners but terrible at asking for listening in return. They can sit with someone's pain for hours, hold space for someone's struggle, offer their full presence without judgment or urgency. They're the person people seek out when they need to be heard. But when it comes to their own pain, their own struggle, they don't know how to ask for the same attention, don't know how to say, "Can you listen to me for a while?" Don't know how to shift from being the holder to being the held. The empathy flows in one direction, and they're comfortable with that imbalance even though it leaves them isolated in their own experience. They appear mysterious to others while feeling completely normal to themselves. People might say they're hard to read, enigmatic, difficult to know, but from their perspective they're not being mysterious at all. They're just being themselves. They're not intentionally withholding information or trying to create intrigue. They're simply existing in the way that feels natural to them, which happens to involve keeping most of their internal world private. The gap between how others perceive them, mysterious, closed off, unknowable, and how they perceive themselves, just regular, nothing special, not particularly complicated, is vast. And this gap itself becomes another source of misunderstanding. They feel lonely in company, but peaceful in solitude. Being around people, even people they like, often intensifies their sense of isolation. Because in social settings they're performing, they're managing, they're maintaining the external presentation while their actual self remains hidden. So they can be in a room full of friends and feel profoundly alone. But when they're actually alone, when there's no one to perform for, no expectations to manage, they often feel more at peace. Solitude doesn't require the split. They can just be, without the exhausting work of managing how they're perceived. The loneliness exists in connection, not in isolation. which is the opposite of what most people experience. They crave deep conversations while keeping all their conversations surface level. They long for exchanges about real things, meaningful things, the kinds of conversations that touch something true and vulnerable. They want to talk about fears, dreams, the nature of existence, what it means to be human. But when opportunities for those conversations arise, they steer away. They keep things light. They deflect depth with humour. They answer profound questions with surface responses. Because wanting deep conversation and being able to have deep conversation are two different things. One is a desire, the other requires vulnerability, and vulnerability still feels too risky even though it's exactly what they want. They're simultaneously afraid of abandonment and afraid of being truly known. Losing someone terrifies them, but someone getting too close also terrifies them. Because if someone truly knows them, truly sees them, what if that person then leaves? What if full revelation leads to rejection? So they maintain a distance that feels safe, but that safety comes at the cost of the intimacy they desire. They want permanent connection, but can't risk full revelation. And these two fears trap them in a middle space where they're neither fully alone nor fully connected, neither completely isolated nor completely intimate. They appear low maintenance while being emotionally complex. To others they seem easy, undemanding. They don't ask for much. They don't create drama. They don't need constant reassurance or attention. They seem like they require very little from relationships. But internally they're navigating intricate emotional landscapes. They have needs that go unspoken. They have reactions they never share. They have responses that remain internal. The low-maintenance exterior exists alongside a high-complexity interior. Both are true. They genuinely don't burden others with demands, and they genuinely experience their relationships with far more emotional nuance than anyone realizes. They observe everything while revealing nothing. They notice the small details about people, the changes in someone's voice when they're stressed, the way someone's posture shifts when they're uncomfortable, the patterns in how people communicate. They're constant observers of human behaviour, including their own. But all this observation remains private. They rarely share what they notice, rarely comment on the patterns they see. So people don't know they're being observed this closely, being seen this clearly. The person who keeps their feelings to themselves often has profound insight into others, but shares almost none of that insight aloud. They're both strong and sensitive simultaneously. They have genuine resilience. They can endure difficult circumstances without falling apart. They can handle pain, disappointment, uncertainty without visible distress. But this strength exists alongside profound sensitivity. They feel things acutely. Small slights wound them. Subtle rejections stay with them. Offhand comments replay in their mind for days. They're not thick-skinned. They're incredibly thin-skinned, but also incredibly good at hiding it. The strength and the sensitivity aren't contradictory. They're complementary. The sensitivity is what they feel. The strength is how they carry what they feel. They want to matter to people while working hard to not be a burden. They want to be important, to be valued, to know they hold a place in someone's life that's meaningful, but simultaneously they minimize their own presence, their own needs, their own emotional impact. They don't want to be too much, too needy, too demanding. So they make themselves small while wanting to be significant. They disappear while wanting to be seen. They become forgettable in their effort to be acceptable, and this creates a dynamic where they matter less than they want to, because they've tried so hard not to matter too much. They're incredibly thoughtful and yet appear thoughtless. They think constantly about their relationships, about what people mean to them, about how to show care, about what others might need. But because this thoughtfulness happens internally and doesn't always translate to visible action, people might experience them as distant or uncaring. They remember everything about you but never mention that they remember. They think about you often but never tell you they're thinking about you. They care deeply about your well-being but don't check in frequently enough for you to know that. The thoughtfulness is real and constant. The appearance of thoughtlessness comes from their struggle to externalize what's happening internally. They're both present and absent at the same time. Physically, they show up. They're there. They're reliable in that way. But emotionally, there's often a sense that part of them is somewhere else, that they're there but not fully there. Their body's in the room, but some essential part of them remains behind a wall. People can sense this divided presence even if they can't articulate it. It feels like talking to someone through glass. You can see them, you can hear them, but something prevents full contact. And this isn't intentional withholding, not exactly. It's just that full presence requires full vulnerability, and full vulnerability still feels impossible. They live with emotional ambivalence as their baseline state, not knowing whether they want closeness or distance, not sure whether they want to open up or stay closed, uncertain whether they're better off expressing feelings or continuing to contain them. This ambivalence isn't indecision exactly. It's the simultaneous existence of contradictory desires. They want both things. They fear both things. And so they hover in the middle, never fully choosing either option, living in the tension between opposing needs. And perhaps the most painful paradox is this. They're everyone's safe person while feeling like no one is their safe person. People come to them with secrets, struggles, vulnerable admissions. People trust them with things they don't tell anyone else. People feel safe opening up to them because they're non-judgmental, because they listen without trying to fix, because they hold space without making it about themselves. But who holds space for them? Who is their safe person? Often, no one. Not because safe people don't exist, but because they haven't allowed anyone into that role, haven't tested whether someone could hold them the way they hold others. So they become sanctuaries for everyone while remaining their own fortress, accessible to others but isolated in themselves. These paradoxes don't make them inconsistent or confusing, though others might interpret it that way. They make them human, complicated in the way humans are complicated, holding multiple truths at once because life, emotion, relationships, none of these things are simple or one-dimensional. The paradoxes aren't problems to solve. They're not contradictions that need resolution. They're simply the reality of existing as someone who has learned to feel deeply while expressing minimally. Someone who has built an internal world rich with complexity while maintaining an external world simple in its presentation. And they carry these contradictions quietly, the same way they carry everything else, not complaining about the tension, not asking for help reconciling the opposites, just living in the both and, in the yes and no, in the want and fear, in the depth and the silence. Living as someone who is simultaneously more and less than others perceive, more feeling than shows, more caring than expresses, more present than appears, more vulnerable than reveals, more lonely than admits, more everything while seeming like nothing much at all. And the exhaustion of holding all these contradictions at once, of being multiple truths simultaneously, of never fully resolving into one clear, simple way of being. This exhaustion is just another thing they carry alone. another weight no one else sees, another complexity they navigate in the privacy of their own consciousness, where all paradoxes live side by side without resolution, without explanation, without needing to make sense to anyone but themselves. And so these paradoxes they carry, these contradictions they live within, rarely get seen for what they actually are. Because the outside world doesn't have access to internal complexity. The outside world sees only what's visible, what's shown, what's expressed, and what's expressed is so minimal, so carefully controlled, that others draw conclusions based on incomplete information. They make assumptions, they fill in the blanks with their own interpretations, and almost inevitably those interpretations are wrong. Not slightly wrong. Often completely, fundamentally, painfully wrong. Wrong in a direction that's opposite to the truth, and this creates a specific kind of loneliness that goes beyond simply being unknown. It's the loneliness as being consistently misunderstood. The most common misperception is that they're cold, emotionless, detached, unfeeling. People look at their calm exterior, their minimal expression, their controlled responses, and conclude that nothing much is happening inside, that they don't feel things the way others feel things, that they're somehow less emotional, less affected, less moved by life. And this interpretation couldn't be further from the truth. They feel everything. They feel it deeply, intensely, constantly. But because that feeling doesn't show on their face, doesn't come through in their voice, doesn't translate to visible reactions, people assume the feeling simply doesn't exist. They mistake containment for emptiness. They confuse self-control with lack of emotion. Someone might say to them, "You're so cold," or "You have no emotions or nothing affect you." And hearing this when you're actually the warmest person in the room, when you're feeling everything so much that you've had to develop elaborate systems just to manage it all, is a particular kind of pain. It's being accused of the exact opposite of what you are. It's being seen as what you fear becoming rather than what you actually are. They're not cold, they're careful, they're not emotionless, they're overflowing with emotion that has nowhere to go. They're not unaffected, they're so affected that they've learned to hide it to survive. Another frequent misperception is that they don't care about people, about situations, about outcomes. Because caring, in most people's understanding, comes with visible concern, expressed worry, frequent check-ins, obvious emotional investment. And people who keep their feelings to themselves don't demonstrate caring in these conventional ways. So their caring becomes invisible. Someone might say, "You don't even care," when the truth is they care so much it terrifies them. They care so deeply that they don't know what to do with the intensity of it. So they hold it quietly, protect it privately, never letting anyone see how much they're invested, how much they're affected, how much another person's well-being matters to them. They're often perceived as mysterious, enigmatic, hard to figure out. And people sometimes romanticize this perception, as if being mysterious is intentional or desirable. But from their perspective, there's nothing mysterious about themselves. They're not trying to be enigmatic. They're not cultivating an aura of intrigue. They're just being themselves, which happens to involve privacy, which happens to look like mystery to others. And being called mysterious when you feel ordinary creates a strange disconnect. They're not hiding fascinating secrets. They're just keeping their regular human feelings private. There's no mystery. There's just a boundary between internal and external that others interpret as intrigue when it's really just protection. The perception of intimidation is particularly confusing for them. People sometimes say they're intimidating, unapproachable, hard to talk to, and they genuinely don't understand this because internally they often feel the opposite. They feel shy, uncertain, worried about saying the wrong thing. What others perceive as intimidating confidence is usually just careful control. What looks like aloofness is usually anxiety about connection. What appears as judgmental distance is usually fear of being judged themselves. They're not intimidating, they're intimidated. But their way of handling that intimidation, their retreat into silence and minimal expression, reads to others as coldness or superiority when it's actually neither, and there's a specific pain in being told you're intimidating when you desperately want people to feel comfortable around you, when you want connection but can't figure out how to make yourself approachable, when your self-protection is being interpreted as aggression. They're not trying to keep people away, they're trying to keep themselves safe. But the mechanism of that safety, the walls they've built, the distance they maintain, ends up having the same effect. People stay away. Not because these individuals want that, but because the signals they send unintentionally suggest they want to be left alone. People also frequently tell them they never seem stressed or upset, that nothing ever bothers them, that they're so calm all the time, and these observations meant as compliments land strangely. Because everything bothers them, they're stressed often, they're upset internally even when their face shows nothing. The calm others perceive isn't real calm, it's practice control, it's the performance they've mastered. But because the performance is so convincing, people take it at face value. They believe the calm is genuine, they think nothing is wrong, and so they don't ask questions, they don't check in, they don't offer support. Because why would you offer support to someone who seems perfectly fine? This creates a cruel cycle. They appear fine, so no one asks if they're okay. No one asks, so they continue appearing fine. The pattern reinforces itself, and meanwhile they're carrying everything alone, wishing someone would notice, would see through the performance, would recognize that the calm exterior is hiding something much more turbulent. But how can people notice what's carefully hidden? How can people offer help to someone who shows no sign of needing it? They're also frequently described as having it all together, as being mature, responsible, stable, grounded, as being the person who never falls apart. And in some ways these perceptions are accurate. They do handle things, they're reliable, they don't create visible chaos. But what others don't see is the internal process of holding themselves together, the constant work of managing emotions, processing feelings, maintaining equilibrium without external support. They look like they have it together because they've learned to function while falling apart internally. The togetherness is external, the falling apart is private. There's also a misperception about their needs, because they never ask for help, never express vulnerability, never admit to struggling. People assume they don't have needs, that they're self-sufficient not just behaviourally but fundamentally, that they genuinely don't require the support, attention, reassurance that other people need. And this assumption becomes self-fulfilling. If people believe you don't need anything, they don't offer anything, and then you truly are left to handle everything alone, not because you wanted it that way, but because you've been so convincing in appearing to not need help that help stops being offered. Their silence gets misinterpreted in dozens of ways. Silence read as agreement when they're actually uncomfortable disagreeing. Silence read as disinterest when they're actually deeply engaged but don't know what to say. Silence read as judgment when they're actually processing, thinking, trying to understand. Silence read as apathy when they're actually overwhelmed by how much they care. The silence itself is neutral, but people project meaning onto it, and those projections are often wrong. When they don't respond emotionally to something difficult, people sometimes think they're unaffected. Someone shares bad news and they respond with calm, with practical questions, with problem solving, and the person sharing might think they don't even care. But the calm response isn't lack of caring. It's their way of being helpful. It's their default mode. The emotional response is happening internally, but what they offer externally is steadiness, because steadiness is what they know how to give. They're trying to be supportive, but their support looks different than others expect, so it gets misread as coldness. There's also the frustration of being misunderstood about motivation. When they withdraw, people think they're being distant or punishing or playing games, when really they're just overwhelmed and need space. When they don't share feelings, people think they're being manipulative or withholding, when really they just don't know how to articulate what's happening inside. When they appear unbothered, people think they're arrogant or superior, when really they're just trying to stay regulated, trying not to burden others, trying to manage in the only way they know how. And perhaps most painful is when people who love them express frustration about not knowing them. A partner might say, "After all this time, I still don't really know you." A close friend might say, "You never tell me what's actually going on with you." Family might say, "You're always so distant, we can never reach you." And these statements hurt because they're simultaneously true and not true. True in that these people don't have full access to their internal world. Not true in that they're not being intentionally distant, not purposefully keeping people out. They want to be known. They just don't know how to be known. Don't know how to bridge the gap between internal and external. Don't know how to translate their complexity into words someone else could understand. The gap between self-perception and others' perception creates a strange kind of alienation. They know who they are internally. They know their depth, their sensitivity, their capacity for feeling. But everyone else sees something different, and over time they start to wonder which version is true. Are they who they know themselves to be, or are they who everyone else thinks they are? Maybe the external version is the real one and the internal version is the delusion. Maybe they're fooling themselves about their own depth. Maybe they really are cold, unfeeling, distant, and the warmth they believe they carry is imaginary. This doubt is particularly insidious, because when enough people tell you you're one way, you start to believe them even when their perception contradicts your lived experience. When person after person says you're emotionless, you start to question whether you actually feel things or just think you feel things. When people consistently interpret your behaviour as uncaring, you start to wonder if maybe you don't care the way you believe you care. The external perception has weight, has authority, has consensus, and your internal knowledge is private, unwitnessed, unconfirmed by anyone else. So which do you trust? But here's what they often forget, what they need to remember. Other people's perceptions are based on incomplete information. People are making judgments based only on what's visible, what's shared, what crosses from internal to external. And in their case, very little crosses that boundary. So of course people misunderstand. Of course interpretations are wrong. Not because people are malicious or unobservant, but because they're working with maybe 10% of the actual data. They're looking at the tip of an iceberg and describing it as if they can see the whole thing. The misperceptions aren't accurate. They're projections, they're guesses, they're attempts to make sense of limited information, and the person who keeps their feelings to themselves is not responsible for correcting every misperception, for explaining themselves to everyone who misunderstands. But they also don't have to internalize those misperceptions as truth, don't have to accept that who others think they are is who they actually are. The internal knowledge, the private understanding of their own depth, their own feeling, their own complexity, that knowledge is valid even if no one else confirms it, even if no one else sees it, even if they're chronically misunderstood by nearly everyone they encounter. Being misread is lonely, it's frustrating, it's sometimes enraging. To be seen as the opposite of what you are, to be judged by people who don't know you, to be labelled as cold when you're burning inside, as uncaring when you care too much, as together when you're falling apart, as fine when nothing is fine. The gap between perception and reality becomes a space you inhabit alone, a space where you're the only person who knows the truth, where validation can only come from yourself, because it's certainly not coming from others. And maybe this is part of why they continue keeping their feelings to themselves, because being misunderstood when you're closed is painful but familiar. But being misunderstood even after opening up, after making yourself vulnerable, after trying to explain, after offering someone access to your internal world, only to have them still misunderstand, still misinterpret, still get it wrong, that might be worse. So they stay closed, stay private, stay in the familiar loneliness of being unseen rather than risk the worse loneliness of being seen and still misunderstood. At least this way, the misperceptions aren't based on their truth. They're based on the performance, and the performance they can maintain, control, adjust as needed. But their truth, once shared, is out of their hands, and that feels too dangerous, too uncontrollable, too likely to end in disappointment. And yet, despite all the misunderstanding, despite all the loneliness, despite all the weight they carry, there is something that often goes unacknowledged, something that exists alongside all the difficulty. Because adaptations, even painful ones, often create capacities that wouldn't exist otherwise, and people who keep their feelings to themselves have developed abilities, insights, strengths that are genuine even if they came at a cost. This isn't about making pain worthwhile or suggesting their struggle is necessary. It's simply recognizing that when you spend years navigating your internal world alone, when you become your own support system, when you learn to observe rather than participate, certain things develop, certain gifts emerge. Not gifts anyone would choose in exchange for the pain, but gifts nonetheless. Real capacities that exist because of, not in spite of, how they learn to be. They become extraordinary listeners, not just polite listeners, not just patient listeners, but deeply attentive listeners. The kind of listening that makes people feel genuinely heard, genuinely seen, genuinely understood. And this capacity develops naturally from their way of being, because they're not waiting for their turn to talk. They're not formulating their response while the other person is still speaking. They're not making the conversation about themselves. They're simply present, fully focused on what's being shared, attending to not just the words but the emotion beneath the words, the meaning between the lines, the truth that's sometimes hard for the speaker themselves to articulate. People feel safe with them in a way they don't feel safe with others. There's something about their presence that invites vulnerability. Maybe it's the lack of judgment. Maybe it's the way they don't rush to fix or advise or minimize. Maybe it's how they can sit with difficult emotions without trying to make them go away. Whatever the reason, people open up to them, tell them things they don't tell others, trust them with secrets, fears, shameful admissions, vulnerable truths. And they hold all of this with care, with discretion, with genuine respect for what they've been entrusted with. This happens because they understand, at a cellular level, what it feels like to carry something alone. They know the weight of unspoken things. They know what it's like to need understanding without needing solutions. They know the difference between someone who listens to respond and someone who listens to understand. And because they know these things from experience, they offer the kind of presence they wish someone would offer them. They become for others what they've never had for themselves. Their observational skills are remarkable. They notice things others miss entirely. Small changes in someone's demeanour, shifts in energy when certain topics arise, the gap between what someone says and what their body language reveals, patterns in how people behave when stressed versus comfortable. They see all of this because they've spent so much time watching rather than participating, observing rather than expressing. They've learned to read people, situations, rooms, with an accuracy that borders on uncanny. And this isn't paranoia or hypervigilance, though it may have roots there. It's genuine perception. They simply notice more because they're always taking in information rather than projecting it outward. This observational capacity gives them insight into human behaviour that most people never develop. They understand motivation in complex ways. They can see past the surface of what people do to why they're doing it. They recognise when someone's anger is actually hurt, when someone's withdrawal is actually overwhelm, when someone's coldness is actually protection. They understand these things because they've spent years analysing their own internal processes, and that analysis transfers. They know human psychology not from textbooks but from intensive self-study that then becomes a lens for understanding others. They develop sophisticated emotional intelligence, though it might not look like traditional emotional intelligence. They're not necessarily good at expressing their own emotions or managing visible emotional dynamics. But their internal understanding of feelings, their ability to distinguish between subtle variations of similar emotions, their capacity to identify what they're feeling and why, this is remarkably developed. They have language for emotional states most people never differentiate. They know the specific texture of different kinds of loneliness, different flavours of anxiety, different qualities of sadness. This granularity, this precision in understanding emotion, is a form of intelligence that serves them even if others never see it. Their independence is genuine, not reactive independence, not defensive independence, but actual capacity for emotional self-sufficiency. They genuinely can handle difficult things alone, can process grief, navigate fear, manage anxiety without requiring external support. This doesn't mean they wouldn't benefit from support, but they have real capability that many people don't develop. They've learned to self-soothe, to self-regulate, to self-analyze in ways that work. They're not dependent on others for emotional equilibrium. They've built internal structures that provide stability even when external circumstances are unstable. This independence makes them reliable in ways others aren't. They don't fall apart in crisis. They don't require constant reassurance or validation. They don't create drama or emotional chaos. They can be counted on to maintain themselves, to not need rescuing, to handle their portion of life's difficulties without burdening others. And while this reliability comes at a cost to them, it's also a genuine strength. They're the person you can depend on, the one who won't add to the chaos, the one who remains steady when everything else is turbulent. They're profoundly thoughtful, not just in the sense of being kind, though they often are, but thoughtful in the sense of full of thought. They reflect, they consider, they examine their experiences, their reactions, their patterns. They don't just live life, they think about life, analyze it, try to understand it, and this creates a depth of self-awareness that many people never achieve. They know themselves, not perfectly, not completely, but they know their patterns, their triggers, their tendencies in ways that come from years of internal examination. They've done the work of self-understanding that others often avoid. This self-awareness makes them insightful about human nature generally. They've spent so much time understanding their own psychology that they've inadvertently learned about psychology itself. They recognize patterns in others because they've recognized them in themselves. They understand defense mechanisms, coping strategies, emotional patterns not from academic study, but from lived experience and intensive reflection. They carry wisdom that feels older than their years, because they've thought more deeply about their experiences than most people do. They don't overwhelm others with their emotions, and while this comes from their tendency to withhold, it's also a gift to the people around them. They're not emotionally demanding. They don't create crises. They don't expect others to manage their feelings for them. They don't use their emotions to manipulate or control. They take responsibility for their own emotional experience. And in a world where many people externalize their emotions, where emotional regulation often means making your feelings someone else's problem, there's something valuable about someone who doesn't do that, who carries their own weight, who doesn't make their internal state everyone else's emergency. They're also remarkably non-judgmental, because they've spent so much time with their own complexity, their own contradictions, their own less than perfect reactions. They don't judge others harshly. They understand that people are complicated, that everyone has reasons for how they behave, that very little is as simple as it appears. They extend to others the same compassionate analysis they extend to themselves. They don't rush to condemn. They consider context. They look for understanding rather than judgment. And this makes them safe, makes people feel accepted in ways they don't feel accepted elsewhere. Their capacity to hold space is exceptional. They can be present with someone's pain without trying to fix it, can witness someone struggle without making it about themselves, can allow difficult emotions to exist without rushing to make them go away. This is rare. Most people are so uncomfortable with negative emotions that they immediately try to solve, minimize, or redirect. But people who keep their feelings to themselves understand that sometimes emotions just need to be felt, need to be witnessed, need to be allowed, and they can provide that because they've spent so much time sitting with their own difficult emotions alone. They know those feelings don't destroy you. They know you can survive them, so they're not afraid of them in others. They become sanctuaries, places where people can be themselves without performance, where vulnerability is met with compassion rather than judgment, where secrets are safe, where pain is acknowledged rather than dismissed, where complexity is understood rather than simplified. They create this kind of space naturally, without trying, simply by being who they are. And for the people who encounter this sanctuary, it's profound, it's rare, it's the kind of presence that can change someone's life, make someone feel less alone, Remind someone that they're not broken just because they're struggling. And there's wisdom in how they love. It's quiet love, steady love. Love that doesn't announce itself but shows itself through consistency, through paying attention, through remembering, through being reliable, through small acts of care that add up over time. Their love isn't loud, but it's deep. It isn't dramatic, but it's sincere. And for people who can receive love this way, who can recognize care in actions rather than needing it in words, this love is profound. It's the kind of love that doesn't waver, that doesn't depend on mood or circumstance, that exists as a constant even when it's not being actively demonstrated. They also develop resilience, real resilience, not the kind that looks impressive but breaks under pressure, but the kind that endures, the kind that keeps going even when tired, the kind that has survived enough to know that survival is possible. They've been through difficulty, they've navigated pain, they've handled things alone that might have broken someone who had to do it with an audience, and they're still here, still functioning, still moving forward. That's not nothing, that's strength, quiet strength, unrecognized strength, but genuine nonetheless. Their inner world, for all its privacy, is rich in ways that external lives sometimes aren't. They have depth, layers, complexity. They're interesting to know if you can get access. They've thought about things. They have perspectives that come from genuine reflection, rather than just repeating what others say. They have insights earned through experience and analysis. They're not shallow, not simple, not one-dimensional. There's always more to discover, more to understand, if anyone is patient enough to look beyond the surface. And perhaps most importantly, they have the capacity to sit with themselves, to be alone without feeling lonely, to exist in their own company without needing constant external stimulation or validation. In a world that's increasingly unable to tolerate solitude, that treats being alone as something to fix or avoid, there's something valuable about someone who can simply be, who doesn't need to fill every silence, who can exist comfortably in stillness, who's developed an internal richness that makes external chaos less necessary. None of these gifts make the pain worth it. None of these strengths justify the loneliness, the misunderstanding, the weight they carry. This isn't about silver linings or finding the positive in suffering. It's simply about acknowledging truth. The truth that adaptation, even painful adaptation, creates capacity. That learning to handle everything alone does develop genuine capability. That years of internal processing does create insight. That being forced to become self-sufficient does build actual strength. And maybe part of what makes their existence so complex is that both things are true simultaneously. The pain is real and the gifts are real. The loneliness is genuine and the wisdom is genuine. The cost is high and the capacity is remarkable. They're not better off for having gone through what they've gone through, but they're also not empty, not broken, not without value because of it. They've become someone specific, someone with particular strengths, someone whose way of being, for all its difficulty, has created something that didn't exist before. A way of seeing, a way of understanding, a way of being present, a way of loving, a way of enduring. And the people whose lives they've touched, the people who've experienced their listening, their presence, their sanctuary, those people know something that the person themselves might not recognize, that there's value in who they've become, that their quiet strength matters, that their careful love counts, that their steady presence provides something the world needs, that even if they never speak their feelings aloud, they communicate something essential through who they are and how they show up. Something real, something rare, something that exists because they survived the only way they knew how, and in surviving, became someone who understands certain human truths that can't be learned any other way. And so, a question emerges, not a demand, not an imperative, just a gentle question that sits quietly in the space between what is and what might be. The question is this: what if opening, even just slightly, were possible? Not opening as transformation, not opening as becoming someone completely different, but opening as gentle experimentation, as slow exploration, as careful, cautious movement towards something that might feel like connection without sacrificing safety entirely. Because people who keep their feelings to themselves don't need to change. They're not broken. They're not defective. Their way of being makes complete sense given what they've lived through. But if part of them, even a small part, wants to try something different, wants to test whether vulnerability might be possible in certain spaces with certain people, that possibility exists, not as obligation, as option. The first thing to understand about opening is that it doesn't require dismantling all the protection they've built. The walls, the boundaries, the careful containment, these served them. These kept them safe when safety wasn't guaranteed elsewhere. And they might still need these protections, might still want them. Opening doesn't mean tearing down everything. It means finding one small door, one window, one point of access that can be opened selectively, carefully, with full control over when and how and with whom. Because not everyone deserves access. This is crucial. Not everyone has earned the right to their vulnerability. Not everyone is safe. Not everyone can hold what they might share with care and respect, and people who keep their feelings to themselves often have excellent instincts about this, even if they don't always trust those instincts. They can sense who is safe and who isn't, who has capacity and who doesn't, who would honour their openness and who would exploit it. The work isn't about opening to everyone. It's about recognizing when someone actually is safe, and then maybe considering whether that safety is enough to risk a small revelation. Safety isn't something that can be determined immediately. It's earned over time, through consistency, through how someone responds to small tests, through patterns of behaviour that demonstrate care, discretion, respect. And one of the ways to begin assessing safety is through titrated vulnerability. Small doses, tiny experiments, sharing something minor and seeing what happens. Not diving into the deep end, but dipping a toe in the water. Testing whether this person can handle a small truth before offering them a larger one. These experiments might look like this. Saying I'm actually a bit tired today instead of I'm fine. Admitting that situation is stressing me out instead of deflecting with humour. Mentioning I've been thinking about something instead of keeping every thought private. These are small revelations. They don't expose your entire internal world. But they crack the door slightly. They allow someone to see a fraction more of what's happening inside. And then you wait. You observe. How did they respond? Did they minimize? Did they respect it? Did they ask genuine questions or change the subject? Did they remember later or forget immediately? Did sharing feel terrible or maybe slightly okay? If the response is good, if the person handles that small vulnerability with care, you might try again, something slightly bigger, still small enough to feel manageable, but a step further, and you keep testing, Keep observing. Keep assessing whether this person continues to be safe as you reveal more. Not rushing, not forcing yourself to open fully all at once, but gradually learning whether trust might be possible here. Whether this could be someone who can hold your truth without breaking it. And if the response isn't good, if they minimize, dismiss, gossip, or respond in ways that feel unsafe, then you close the door again. You return to your baseline. You honor the instinct that says this person isn't ready, isn't capable, isn't safe. And that's okay. That's not failure. That's wisdom. That's listening to what your experience is telling you. Not everyone gets access. Most people shouldn't get access. Opening is selective, intentional, reserved for the rare individuals who've proven through consistent action that they can be trusted. There's also the reality that even with safe people, opening will probably feel uncomfortable at first. Because discomfort doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes discomfort means unfamiliarity, means doing something you're not used to doing, means activating parts of yourself that have been dormant for a long time. The vulnerability hangover might still happen, the regret might still surface, the impulse to close back up might be strong, and all of that is normal, expected, not evidence that you made a mistake, but evidence that you're doing something that feels risky even when it's actually safe. Learning to tolerate this discomfort is part of the process. Learning that you can feel regretful about sharing and survive that regret, that you can feel exposed, and that exposure doesn't actually destroy you, that someone knowing something true about you doesn't automatically lead to the consequences you fear. This learning happens slowly, through repeated experiences where vulnerability doesn't end badly, where someone responds with care instead of judgment, where being seen doesn't lead to abandonment or exploitation, or the other outcomes your nervous system learned to expect. Therapy, if it's accessible and feels acceptable, can be one place to practice this. Because therapists, good ones at least, are professionally trained to hold vulnerability, to not be reactive, to create safety intentionally, to let you practice opening without the complexity of reciprocal relationship. You can share things you've never shared with anyone. You can practice putting feelings into words. You can test whether speaking your internal experience aloud changes it somehow, or makes it more manageable. And because the relationship is boundaried, because the therapist isn't someone in your regular life, the stakes feel lower. The risk feels more contained. But therapy isn't the only option. Safe friendships can serve this purpose. The friend who's proven through years of consistency that they won't gossip, won't judge, won't minimize. The person who's demonstrated care even when you've given them nothing in return. Sometimes these people exist in your life already, waiting, not pushing, but available. And maybe with them, you could try something small. Could say something true. Could let them see one layer deeper than you typically allow. Or maybe opening happens through indirect expression first. Through writing, through art, through any form of creation that lets you externalize what has been internal without requiring immediate interpersonal vulnerability. You write the email, and maybe this time you actually send it. You make the art that expresses your actual feelings rather than abstract concepts. You let something real show through. Not to everyone, not publicly, but to one person, or to yourself. Sometimes opening to yourself, acknowledging your own feelings fully even in private, is the necessary first step before opening to anyone else becomes possible. And it's important to understand that opening isn't linear. It's not a steady progression from close to open. It's more like a pendulum. You open slightly, then close again. You share something, then retreat. You let someone in, then need space. This back and forth isn't failure. It's how the nervous system works. It needs to return to safety, to baseline, to the familiar protection before venturing out again. Pendulation, moving between openness and protection as needed, honouring both the desire for connection and the need for safety. Not forcing yourself to stay open when you need to close, and not forcing yourself to stay closed when you might be ready to try opening again. The goal isn't to become someone who shares everything with everyone. The goal, if there even needs to be a goal, is simply to have the option. To not be trapped behind walls you can't ever cross even when you might want to. To build a door you can choose to open rather than being permanently sealed inside. Choice is the point, not constant openness, not performance of vulnerability, just the genuine option to share when it feels right, with people who've earned it, in ways that honour your own pace and comfort. And part of this process involves recognising the difference between people who demand vulnerability and people who invite it. Some people will say things like, "You need to open up," or "Why won't you just tell me how you feel?" And these demands, even when they come from care, often make opening harder, because demands activate defence. They feel like pressure, like something being taken rather than offered. But other people create space without demanding. They're available without being pushy. They signal safety through their own vulnerability, through their patience, through their willingness to wait without resentment. These are the people who might actually be safe to open with. Boundaries remain essential even in opening, maybe especially in opening, because boundaries are what make vulnerability sustainable. You can say, "I need to talk about something, but I might not be able to talk about it for long," or "I want to share this, but I don't want advice, just listening," or "This is difficult to talk about, so I might need to stop and come back to it later." These boundaries protect you while allowing connection. They let you control the pace, the depth, the duration of vulnerability, and people who are truly safe will respect these boundaries without making you feel guilty for having them. There's also something important about learning to receive, because people who keep their feelings to themselves are often excellent at giving support but terrible at receiving it. Learning to let someone care for you, comfort you, help you, this is its own form of vulnerability. Asking for help is vulnerability. Accepting comfort is vulnerability. Letting someone see you struggle is vulnerability. And sometimes this feels harder than sharing feelings because it requires trusting that someone wants to give to you, that you're not a burden, that your needs are acceptable. But receiving is part of connection. Relationships require flow in both directions, and if you only ever give, if you never let anyone give back, you're still keeping yourself protected, still preventing full intimacy. The process of opening also involves compassion for yourself, compassion for how hard this is, for how much courage it takes to risk vulnerability when vulnerability has historically felt dangerous, for the times you try and can't do it, for the moments you retreat even when you wanted to stay open, for the vulnerability hangovers, for the regret, for all the complicated feelings that arise when you're trying to change patterns that have been with you for years, maybe decades. This isn't easy. It's not supposed to be easy. And being patient with yourself through the difficulty is essential. It also helps to remember that your way of being, your tendency to keep feelings to yourself, developed for legitimate reasons. It made sense, it protected you, and it still makes sense now. You're not being asked to invalidate your protection or pretend it wasn't necessary. You're simply being invited to consider whether, with certain safe people, in certain safe moments, the protection might not be as necessary anymore. Whether you've found people who wouldn't hurt you the way you learned to expect hurt. Whether circumstances have changed even if your defences haven't yet caught up. And maybe opening looks different than you imagine. Maybe it's not about becoming someone who talks about feelings constantly, who processes everything aloud, who needs verbal connection. Maybe it's about finding your own authentic way of sharing. Maybe you're someone who shares better in writing than in speech. Someone who opens up during activities rather than in direct conversation. Someone who reveals themselves gradually through actions rather than through declarations. Your way of opening doesn't have to look like anyone else's way. It just has to feel true to you. There's no timeline for this, no deadline, no requirement that you figure it out by a certain age or reach a certain level of openness. You're allowed to move at your own pace, to take breaks, to decide that for now you're not ready, and that's completely okay. Opening is always an option, which means choosing not to open right now is equally valid. You get to decide, you get to assess, you get to honour what feels right for you in each moment, with each person, in each circumstance. And perhaps what's most important to understand is this: opening, if and when you choose it, doesn't mean you were wrong before, doesn't mean the protection was bad or unnecessary or something to regret. It just means you're adding options, you're expanding capacity, you're learning that you can be both protected and connected, that you can keep some walls while opening some doors, that you can honour your need for privacy while also allowing for intimacy and select relationships. Both can exist, the protection and the connection, the privacy and the sharing, the self-sufficiency and the interdependence. You're not choosing between being closed or being open. You're learning to be both. To hold the paradox, to remain essentially yourself, fundamentally private, naturally contained, while also having the capacity, when you want it, when it feels safe, when someone has earned it, to let them see something real, something true, something that lives in the vast internal world you've been carrying alone, not because you have to, not because you should, not because keeping feelings to yourself is wrong, but because connection, real connection, might be something you want. And if you want it, even just a little, even just with one person, even just sometimes, that possibility exists. That door, however small, can open. When you're ready, if you're ready, and only as much as feels safe. The protection served you, it can continue serving you, but it can also flex, can adapt, can allow for exceptions, for safe people, for moments when the risk feels worth it, and you get to decide when those moments are. You get to choose who those people are. You get to control how much you reveal, and when you close the door again, all the power remains with you, all the choice, all the agency. You're not being asked to change. You're being reminded that change, if you want it, in whatever small increments feel manageable, is possible. Not necessary, just possible. And that possibility, that option, is yours to explore or ignore as you see fit. No pressure, no judgment, just gentle recognition that the walls you built to keep yourself safe don't have to be permanent. They can have doors, and doors can open whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, and it's completely okay if you're not. And so here you are, carrying everything quietly as you always have, holding your internal world with care even when no one sees the weight of it. You are not closed. You're careful. You're not cold. You're protecting something tender. You're not empty. You're full of everything you've never said aloud, and all of this makes complete sense. Your silence has been your safety. Your privacy has been your sanctuary. Your containment has been your survival. And none of that is wrong. None of that makes you broken or insufficient or less than whole. You exist exactly as you need to exist. And whether you stay exactly as you are or whether you slowly, gently begin to open in small ways with safe people, either path is valid. Either choice is yours. You're understood, even if only in this moment, even if only here. Someone knows what it's like to carry what you carry. Someone sees the depth you hold privately. Someone recognizes that your quietness is not emptiness, but fullness that has learned to stay contained. And now you can rest. You can let your mind soften. You can release the need to explain yourself, to perform, to manage how you're perceived. Here in this quiet darkness, you can simply be. Everything you carry can stay exactly where it is while you drift into sleep. You are safe. You are whole. You are enough. Let yourself rest now. Just rest.